In the early 1950s, a restless dreamer named Walt Disney found himself watching his daughters ride a carousel in Griffith Park, Los Angeles. Sitting on a bench eating peanuts, he began to imagine something different, a place where parents and children could have fun together, where fantasy became tangible and memories were made as a family. This quiet moment would spark one of the most ambitious projects in entertainment history. Walt had been toying with the idea since the 1930s, initially calling it Mickey Mouse Park. But after World War II, his vision began to crystallize into something far grander. He assembled a small, secret team of designers and architects, people who would later become known as Imagineers, and set them to work in a nondescript building across the street from his Burbank Studios. They weren't just designing rides. They were inventing an entirely new art form. The challenge was finding someone to believe in it. When Walt approached bankers with his plans in the early 1950s, they laughed him out of their offices. Amusement parks were seen as dirty, dangerous places filled with carnival barkers and rig games. The idea that one could be clean, safe, and family-oriented seemed absurd to the financial establishment of the time. Undeterred, Walt did something unprecedented. He turned to television. In 1954, he struck a deal with the ABC television network that would change everything. ABC agreed to help finance his park in exchange for a weekly television show. That show, Disneyland, would not only help fund the park, but also serve as a weekly advertisement, building anticipation across America for a place that didn't yet exist. With financing secured, Walt needed land, lots of it. He found 160 acres of orange groves in a sleepy Southern California town called Anaheim, about 25 miles south of Los Angeles. The land cost $4,500 per acre. And while it seemed far from the city at the time, Walt had vision. He knew the freeway system was expanding, and this location would soon be accessible to millions. Construction began on July 16, 1954, and what followed was a frantic, year-long race against time. The park needed to open in summer 1955 to take advantage of the peak tourist season. 12 months to build an entire kingdom. It seemed impossible. Workers labored around the clock, sometimes in triple shifts, as Walt personally oversaw nearly every detail, from the height of the castle turrets to the shade of paint on Main Street's Victorian facades. The centerpiece of this new kingdom would be Sleeping Beauty Castle, rising 77 feet into the California sky. Walt intentionally designed it using forced perspective, a technique borrowed from film, making it appear taller than it actually was. The castle would become the most photographed structure in the world, but in those frantic construction months, it was just another impossible deadline. As opening day approached, July 17, 1955, Walt made a decision that revealed both his showmanship and his nervousness. He would invite the press and special guests to an invitation-only preview, a dedication day, before opening to the general public. ABC would broadcast the entire event live, hosted by three of Hollywood's biggest stars, Art Linkletter, Bob Cummings, and Ronald Reagan. It would be the largest live broadcast ever attempted, with 22 cameras and 90 million viewers watching from home. But in those final days before opening, Walt Disney paced the unfinished pathways of his dream, wondering if the world would understand what he was trying to create, not just an amusement park, but something he called a place for people to find happiness and knowledge. July 17, 1955 dawned hot and chaotic. What should have been Walt Disney's greatest triumph quickly revealed itself as a day that would live in infamy, at least among those who were there. The park wasn't ready. It couldn't possibly be ready. But ready or not, 90 million people were about to watch on live television. Walt had printed 15,000 invitations for his exclusive preview day, but counterfeiters had been busy. By mid-morning, nearly 28,000 people had pushed through the gates, almost twice the expected crowd. Some had scaled the fences with ladders, others had purchased fake tickets, and a few enterprising souls had simply taught their way past overwhelmed security guards. The carefully planned event was already spiraling into chaos before the official dedication even began. The problems ran deeper than the crowds. Many of the park's attractions simply didn't work. The Mark Twain riverboat, which was supposed to gracefully cruise around the rivers of America, nearly capsized on its first voyage because it had been overloaded with passengers and dignitaries. Women's high heels, it was 1955 after all, kept sinking into the freshly poured asphalt on Main Street, which hadn't fully hardened in the summer heat. Guests had to choose between removing their shoes or leaving them stuck in the pavement. The drinking fountains didn't work. At least, most of them didn't. A plumber strike had forced Disney's team to make an impossible choice: install working toilets or working water fountains. They chose toilets, naturally. But this decision would haunt the day. With temperatures soaring past 100 degrees and thousands of hot, thirsty guests wandering the park, Disneyland quickly earned an unflattering nickname from the press: Black Sunday. Pepsi Cola, one of the park sponsors, was the only beverage readily available, leading cynics to suggest Disney had manufactured the water shortage to sell more soda. In Fantasyland, things were even worse. Several attractions had to be closed entirely because they simply weren't finished. The Storybook Land canal boats sat empty. Walt himself had declared the miniature landscaping looked pathetic and demanded it be completely redone. The canal remained drained, filled with nothing but mud and exposed pipes, a stark reminder that miracles take time, even in the Magic Kingdom. But perhaps the most absurd moment came during the live television broadcast itself. Cameras were everywhere, and the pressure was immense. At one point, a reporter thrust a microphone in front of a young boy and asked him what he thought of Disneyland. The child looked directly into the camera and said, "I think it's boring." The moment was broadcast live to millions of homes across America. Yet somehow, despite everything going wrong, something magical was happening too. Ronald Reagan, standing in Frontierland for a segment of the broadcast, ad-libbed his way through technical difficulties with charm and grace. Art Linkletter interviewed Walt Disney himself, and even through the chaos, Walt's genuine passion and warmth radiated through the television sets. When he dedicated Disneyland with his famous speech, "To all who come to this happy place, welcome," there was an authenticity that no amount of disaster could diminish. The press, however, was merciless. Headlines the next day ranged from disappointed to savage. One reporter wrote that Disneyland was nothing more than a fiasco and predicted it would be closed within a year. Another called it Disney's greatest folly, suggesting the animators should stick to cartoons. Even some of Walt's own executives wondered privately if they'd made a catastrophic mistake. But Walt Disney had built his career on a simple philosophy: never let the audience see your doubts. The day after the disastrous preview, Disneyland opened to the general public, and something remarkable happened. People loved it. Despite the malfunctions, despite the unfinished attractions, despite the heat and the crowds, families returned home with stories of wonder. Within just 7 weeks, 1 million guests had walked through those gates, and Walt knew he'd been right all along. The disasters of opening day would fade into legend, but the magic, that would only grow stronger. Within its first year, Disneyland welcomed over 3.6 million visitors, a number that stunned even Walt's most optimistic projections. The park that critics had dismissed as a certain failure was generating lines that stretched for hours, and more importantly, it was creating something money couldn't easily measure: pure joy. But Walt Disney wasn't the type to rest on success. To him, Disneyland would never be finished, and he meant that literally. In 1956, just 1 year after opening, Walt added Disneyland's first major new attraction, the Skyway. These colorful gondolas would carry guests high above the park, gliding from Fantasyland to Tomorrowland and back again. It was a simple concept to ski lift adapted for a theme park, but it offered something revolutionary: a chance to see the entire kingdom from above, to understand the scope of Walt's vision in a single breathtaking journey. The Skyway would operate for nearly 38 years, becoming a beloved part of the Disneyland experience. But Walt had bigger ambitions brewing, particularly for Tomorrowland. The 1955 version had been rushed. Even Walt admitted it was little more than a corporate showcase, filled with sponsor exhibits that felt more like advertisements than attractions. He wanted to rebuild it entirely, to create a vision of the future that would inspire rather than simply sell products. In 1959, he got his chance when the park underwent its first major expansion. The timing was perfect. America was in the grip of space-age fever, captivated by satellites and rockets and the promise of exploring beyond Earth. Walt partnered with rocket scientists, actual rocket scientists, including Wernher von Braun, to create attractions that didn't just entertain but educated. The result was a completely reimagined Tomorrowland that included the Matterhorn bobsleds, the submarine voyage, and an expanded monorail system. This 1959 expansion cost $6 million, more than the entire original park. The Matterhorn bobsleds hold a special place in theme park history. It was the world's first tubular steel roller coaster. Before this innovation, roller coasters were built from wood, which limited their design possibilities. The steel track allowed for smoother rides, tighter turns, and more complex layouts. At 147 feet tall, the Matterhorn wasn't just an attraction, it was a mountain, 1/100th scale of the actual Swiss peak, complete with fake snow and eventually a basketball court hidden inside for cast members on their breaks. The submarine voyage was equally ambitious. 8 submarines, each holding 38 passengers, would descend into an underwater world where mermaids swam past portholes and sea serpents lurked in grottos. Of course, the submarines didn't actually submerge. They ran on tracks in a carefully controlled lagoon. But the illusion was so complete that guests emerged believing they'd been on a genuine underwater expedition. The attraction cost $2.5 million alone, an astronomical sum for a single ride in 1959. Walt's monorail was another first, the first daily operating monorail system in the Western Hemisphere. While primarily serving as a transportation system connecting Disneyland to the newly built Disneyland Hotel, it was also a statement. This is what the future of urban transportation could look like. Sleek, quiet, and efficient. The monorail became an icon, featured in newspapers and magazines as proof that Walt Disney wasn't just building entertainment. He was imagining how we might live tomorrow. These expansions established a pattern that would define Disneyland for decades. The park would continuously evolve, always adding, always improving. Walt famously told his Imagineers that Disneyland will never be completed as long as there is imagination left in the world. But this philosophy came with challenges. Constant construction meant constant disruption. Guests might arrive excited for an attraction they'd heard about, only to find it closed for refurbishment or replaced entirely. Yet somehow, the magic persisted. By the end of the 1950s, Disneyland had become more than a theme park. It had become a cultural phenomenon, a pilgrimage site for American families, and proof that dreams, even impossible ones, could be built with enough vision and stubborn determination. Walt Disney had created something that would outlive him. Though in 1959, standing in his reimagined Tomorrowland, he was just getting started. His mind was already wandering to even grander ideas, to a project that would eventually consume his final years. A second park, somewhere across the country, where he could build not just attractions, but an entire city of tomorrow. As the 1960s dawned, Walt Disney became obsessed with something that seemed, even by his standards, utterly mad, bringing inanimate objects to life, not through traditional animation, but through a fusion of robotics, electronics, and theatrical magic that would blur the line between the mechanical and the living. He called this new technology Audio-Animatronics, and it would revolutionize not just Disneyland, but entertainment itself. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a mechanical bird in a cage that Walt had purchased during a trip to New Orleans. He'd been enchanted by its simple movements and chirping sounds, crude as they were. Walt brought it back to his Imagineers and essentially said, "Make it better. Make it real." What followed was years of experimentation, combining synchronized sound recordings with pneumatic actuators and sophisticated programming systems that didn't even have a name yet. In 1963, Walt unveiled the result, the enchanted Tiki Room, Disneyland's first attraction to feature audio-animatronics. The show took place in a Polynesian-themed theater where 225 birds, flowers, and tiki gods would come alive in a 15-minute musical performance. These weren't simple mechanical toys. These figures had multiple points of articulation, coordinated movements, and synchronized dialogue that made them seem almost alive. Jose, Michael, Pierre, and Fritz, the four host macaws, would become as beloved as any cartoon character Walt had ever created. The Tiki Room represented a $2 million gamble on unproven technology, and the technical challenges were immense. Each audio-animatronic figure required its own control system, with movements programmed onto magnetic tape, the same technology used for recording music. One mistake in the programming could throw the entire show out of sync, turning a charming performance into an eerie, nightmarish spectacle of birds moving to the wrong words. But Walt had a bigger vision for this technology. The Tiki Room was just a proof of concept. He was already planning something far more ambitious for the 1964 to 1965 New York World's Fair, where he would create 4 major attractions that would serve as testing grounds for future Disneyland expansions. One of these would feature an audio-animatronic figure more complex than anything attempted before, Abraham Lincoln. Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln debuted at the World's Fair in the Illinois Pavilion, and it left audiences stunned. Here was Abraham Lincoln, or a figure so lifelike that children in the audience gasped, standing up from his chair, delivering a speech compiled from his actual writings, with facial expressions and hand gestures that seemed impossibly human. The figure had 48 different body actions and 15 head movements. When Lincoln's chest rose and fell as if breathing, people in the front rows swore they could see him thinking. The technical achievement was staggering, Creating realistic human movement was exponentially more difficult than animating birds or animals. Humans instinctively recognize when something human-like is wrong, even if they can't articulate what it is. Walt's team had studied films of real people, broken down every gesture into its component parts, and programmed thousands of individual movements to create the illusion of life. One engineer spent weeks just perfecting the way Lincoln's jacket wrinkled when he moved. After the World's Fair closed, Walt brought Lincoln home to Disneyland in 1965, installing the attraction in the Opera House on Main Street. It became an instant classic, though it also became a source of constant anxiety for the maintenance crews. The Lincoln figure was so complex that something was always breaking. A finger would stop moving, or the lip sync would drift slightly out of alignment. Teams of technicians would work overnight shifts, making microscopic adjustments to keep the 16th president performing flawlessly. The success of Audio-Animatronics opened new creative possibilities that had been pure fantasy just years before. Walt could now tell stories with dimensional characters, create entire worlds populated by figures that moved and spoke and sang. He immediately began planning attractions that would have been impossible before: a pirate adventure, a haunted mansion, and even more ambitious projects that were still taking shape in his restless imagination. But the technology also revealed something essential about Walt Disney's philosophy. He wasn't interested in robotics for their own sake. He wasn't trying to replace human performers or create perfect mechanical beings. Instead, he was using technology to enhance storytelling, to create experiences that would transport guests to other times and places. The audio-animatronics weren't the stars. The stories they told were. And in that distinction lay the secret to why Disneyland continued to captivate millions, even as the 1960s brought enormous social changes to America. In a world that was growing more complex and sometimes frightening, Disneyland remained a place where technology served wonder, where innovation created joy, and where a mechanical bird could still make a child believe in magic. By the mid-1960s, Walt Disney was working on multiple fronts, dividing his attention between Disneyland and a secret project in Florida that would consume much of his final years. But he still had one more masterpiece to give to his original park, an attraction that had been gestating in his mind since the earliest days: Pirates of the Caribbean. The idea had actually begun as a walk-through wax museum. Walt envisioned guests strolling past static scenes of pirate life, similar to the wax museums popular in tourist destinations. But after the success of Audio-Animatronics, everything changed. Why settle for lifeless figures when he could create an entire world of pirates that moved, fought, sang, and told story? The walk-through concept was scrapped, and in its place, Walt designed something unprecedented: a boat ride through a living pirate adventure. Construction began in 1965, and the scale was breathtaking. The show building, the massive structure that would house the attraction, was one of the largest at Disneyland, requiring extensive excavation and the use of a hydraulic system to move millions of gallons of water through the ride's channels. The building itself would be cleverly disguised to maintain the illusion that guests were simply entering a small building in New Orleans Square, when in reality they were descending into a vast underground cavern. Pirates of the Caribbean would feature over 120 audio-animatronic figures, more than any attraction Walt had created before. There were drunken pirates singing "Yo-ho, yo-ho, a pirate's life for me," a song specifically composed for the ride by Disney legends Richard and Robert Sherman. There were elaborate battle scenes with cannons firing and ships rocking, a burning town being pillaged, and even a treasure room glittering with gold. Every detail was obsessively crafted, from the smell of gunpowder pumped into certain scenes to the way moonlight filtered through mist over the bayou. But Walt Disney would never see it completed. On December 15, 1966, just months before Pirates of the Caribbean was scheduled to open, Walt Disney died from lung cancer at the age of 65. He had been a heavy smoker for most of his adult life, and despite surgery and treatment, the disease had spread. In his final months, he continued working from his hospital bed, discussing plans for his Florida project and ensuring that his team understood his vision for the attractions still under construction. His death sent shockwaves through the company and the world. Walt wasn't just the creative genius behind Disneyland. He was its soul, the dreamer who had insisted that the impossible was simply something that hadn't been done yet. Without him, many wondered if Disneyland could continue to innovate, or if it would become a static monument to past glories. His brother Roy O. Disney, who had always handled the business side while Walt dreamed, vowed to complete Walt's final projects as a tribute to his brother's legacy. Pirates of the Caribbean opened on March 18, 1967, just 3 months after Walt's passing. It was an immediate triumph, widely regarded as one of the greatest theme park attractions ever created. The 16-minute journey through pirate-infested waters was everything Walt had envisioned. Thrilling, humorous, detailed, and immersive. Guests emerged wanting to ride again immediately, and many would memorize every scene, every joke, every hidden detail that Walt's Imagineers had tucked into the shadows. That same year, New Orleans Square itself officially opened as Disneyland's first new land since the park's debut in 1955. Inspired by the French Quarter of New Orleans, it featured ornate ironwork balconies, gas lamps, and a romantic atmosphere that felt worlds away from Main Street, USA. The land occupied a space that had previously been just walkways and trees, demonstrating Walt's principle that Disneyland should grow and evolve into every available space. New Orleans Square also introduced Blue Bayou Restaurant, which offered one of the most ingenious dining experiences in theme park history. Guests ate their meals in perpetual twilight, seemingly outdoors on the banks of a bayou, while watching boats from Pirates of the Caribbean drift past. In reality, they were inside the show building, but the illusion was so complete, with twinkling fireflies, the sounds of crickets and bullfrogs, and a starlit sky above, that diners forgot they were indoors at all. The opening of Pirates of the Caribbean marked the end of an era and the beginning of another. It was the last attraction Walt Disney personally supervised. His final gift to the park he'd created from orange groves and imagination. But it also proved that his Imagineers had learned his lessons well. They could continue to create magic even without their founder's direct guidance. The question now was whether they could match Walt's ambition and innovation in the years to come, or whether Disneyland had reached its creative peak. As 1967 drew to a close, another attraction that Walt had championed was nearing completion, one that would become equally iconic: the Haunted Mansion. But its journey to opening would be long and troubled, delayed by Walt's death and by creative disagreements about what exactly a Disney haunted house should be. The mansion sat empty on a hill overlooking New Orleans Square, its elegant facade promising mysteries within, while Imagineers worked behind closed doors to bring 999 happy haunts to life. The wait would be worth it, but in 1967, Disneyland was still learning how to move forward while honoring the past, a balance it would need to master in the decades ahead. The Haunted Mansion had been haunting Disneyland in more ways than one. Its elegant antebellum facade had been standing in New Orleans Square since 1963, a beautiful but empty shell that curious guests would peer at, wondering when it would finally open. Walt had announced the attraction years earlier, but bringing it to life proved far more complicated than anyone anticipated. The creative challenge was fundamental. What should a Disney haunted house actually be? Some Imagineers wanted it genuinely frightening, filled with gore and genuine scares that would terrify guests. Others argued it should be funny, filled with silly ghosts and comedic moments more appropriate for families. Walt had wanted both, something that was spooky but not nightmarish, frightening but fun. After his death in 1966, the Imagineers struggled to honor that delicate balance without his guidance to settle disputes. The technical challenges were equally daunting. The mansion would feature 999 audio-animatronic ghosts, spirits, and special effects that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Imagineers invented new techniques specifically for this attraction. Pepper's ghost illusions that made transparent specters dance in a ballroom. A singing bust graveyard where faces seemed to follow guests as they passed, and a hitchhiking ghost effect that made it appear spirits had climbed into your vehicle for the ride home. Finally, on August 9, 1969, nearly 6 years after the building's exterior had been completed, the haunted mansion opened to the public. The wait had been worth it. Guests boarded doom buggies that carried them through 999 rooms, or so the story went, of spectral splendor. A ghostly narrator known as the Ghost Host, voiced by actor Paul Frees, guided them through portraits with eyes that followed. A seance conducted by the mysterious Madame Leota, whose disembodied head floated in a crystal ball, and the grand ballroom where dozens of translucent ghosts waltzed and celebrated an eternal party. The attraction struck the perfect balance between spooky and silly. There were genuinely eerie moments. The stretching room that began each tour with its dark humor about no way out, the corridor of doors that bulged and rattled as unseen entities tried to break through. But there was also absurdist humor. A ghost playing chess with his own decapitated head, singing busts harmonizing in a graveyard, and those cheeky hitchhiking ghosts who wanted to follow you home. The mansion became an instant classic, with wait times regularly exceeding 2 hours. That same year, 1969, marked another milestone. Disneyland welcomed its 100 millionth guest. In just 14 years, Walt's park had drawn more visitors than anyone had dreamed possible. But the world outside Disneyland's gates was changing dramatically. America was embroiled in the Vietnam War. Cities were experiencing civil unrest, and a counterculture movement was challenging traditional values. Disneyland represented something increasingly rare, a place where families could escape the turmoil and experience uncomplicated joy. The early 1970s brought growing pains of a different sort. The park that had once seemed impossibly vast was running out of room. Every available space had been claimed by attractions, shops, or restaurants. If Disneyland wanted to continue Walt's vision of constant evolution, the Imagineers would need to get creative with space. The solution came in 1972 with the opening of Bear Country, Disneyland's newest themed land. Carved out of what had previously been a largely overlooked corner of the park. Bear Country's centerpiece was the Country Bear Jamboree, an attraction that had actually been designed for a ski resort Walt had planned in the Sierra Nevada mountains. That resort was never built, but the show featuring 18 audio-animatronic bears performing country and western music was too good to abandon. The bears had personality in abundance. There was Big Al, who sang off-key but with genuine heart, Liver Lips McGraw with his mournful ballads, and the massive Big Bear, whose deep voice literally shook the theater. The show was charming, funny, and surprisingly sophisticated in its humor. The opening of Bear Country demonstrated that Disneyland could still expand and innovate, even in Walt's absence. But it also revealed limitations. The park had been designed for maybe 10,000 guests per day, yet by the early 1970s, it was regularly hosting 50,000 or more, especially during summer months and holidays. Lines stretched for hours, restaurants struggled to feed the masses, and the intimate, carefully crafted experiences Walt had envisioned were sometimes lost in the crowds. In 1972, Roy O. Disney, Walt's brother and the financial wizard who had made Walt's dreams economically viable, passed away at age 78. He had devoted his final years to completing Walt Disney World in Florida, ensuring his brother's grandest vision came to life. With both Walt and Roy gone, a new generation of leadership took control of the company. Some were Walt's hand-picked successors, Imagineers who had worked alongside him for decades. Others were business executives who had different priorities and different visions for what Disney parks should be. The challenge facing Disneyland as it entered the mid-1970s was existential. Could it remain relevant and innovative, or would it become a nostalgic artifact? A museum of mid-century Americana that people visited to remember how things used to be? The park had already survived longer than most of its critics had predicted. But surviving wasn't enough. Walt had built Disneyland on the principle that it would never be finished, that it would always be growing and changing. The question was whether his successors had the courage to continue that tradition, or whether they would play it safe, protecting what existed rather than risking what might come next. The answer would define the next chapter in Disneyland's story. As America approached its 200th birthday in 1976, Disneyland was preparing its own gift to the nation, Space Mountain, an attraction that would redefine what a theme park roller coaster could be. The concept had been brewing since the 1960s when Walt himself had sketched out ideas for an indoor roller coaster set in outer space. But the technology hadn't existed to make his vision reality. By the mid-1970s, it finally did. Space Mountain opened on May 27, 1977, and it was unlike anything guests had experienced before. From the outside, the gleaming white cone-shaped building dominated Tomorrowland skyline, standing 118 feet tall and resembling a futuristic mountain or perhaps a launching rocket. But the real magic happened inside in complete darkness, where guests boarded rocket ships that hurtled through a simulated galaxy at speeds reaching 32 miles per hour. Not particularly fast by roller coaster standards, but absolutely terrifying when you couldn't see where you were going. The darkness was the key innovation. Without visual reference points, the human brain couldn't anticipate turns or drops, making every moment a surprise. Projected stars, planets, and celestial effects whizzed past, accompanied by a synchronized soundtrack that made riders feel they were genuinely traveling through space. The experience was so disorienting that some guests emerged convinced they'd been traveling much faster than they actually had. The illusion was perfect. Building Space Mountain required demolishing a large section of Tomorrowland and represented a massive investment, approximately $18 million, making it one of the most expensive attractions Disney had built at that time. The structure itself was an engineering marvel, with two separate tracks intertwining within the mountain, allowing the attraction to handle over 2,000 guests per hour. The tracks never touched, but they came close enough that riders sometimes saw another rocket flash past in the darkness, adding to the sensation of Space Mountain's success validated an important principle. Disneyland could still create groundbreaking attractions that honored Walt's spirit of innovation. But not every decision from this era was as inspired. In 1974, the park had removed the Carousel of Progress, one of Walt's personal favorites from the 1964 World's Fair, and shipped it to Walt Disney World. The decision made business sense. The attraction was more popular in Florida, but it represented a troubling trend. Rather than creating new attractions, Disney was sometimes just moving existing ones around, or worse, removing beloved classics to make room for more profitable ventures. The late 1970s also saw Disneyland grappling with changing cultural tastes and economic pressures. The 1973 oil crisis had made Americans more cautious about leisure spending and long-distance travel. Attendance, while still strong, wasn't growing at the explosive rates of the 1960s. Park admission, which had been just $1 in 1955, had climbed to $6.50 by 1977, still reasonable, but individual ride tickets added significantly to the cost of a family visit. Disneyland still operated on a ticket book system, a relic from opening day. Guests purchased books of tickets labeled A through E, with e-tickets reserved for the biggest, most popular attractions like Space Mountain, Pirates of the Caribbean, and the Haunted Mansion. The phrase e-ticket ride entered American vocabulary as shorthand for the ultimate experience. But the system was cumbersome and sometimes frustrating for guests who ran out of e-tickets while still having unused e-tickets for lesser attractions. In 1975, Disneyland introduced America Sings, a rotating theater show in Tomorrowland that used recycled audio-animatronics from the Carousel of Progress. The show was a whimsical journey through American musical history, featuring over 100 singing animals representing different eras and regions. While charming, it felt more like repurposing than innovation. The attraction was well crafted, but it lacked the groundbreaking ambition that had defined Walt's era. It was a symptom of a larger problem. The company was becoming more conservative, more focused on efficiency and profit margins than on pushing boundaries. Yet, there were bright spots. In 1976, the nation's bicentennial year, Disneyland unveiled a spectacular new nighttime show, the Main Street Electrical Parade. This wasn't just fireworks or projections. This was a procession of floats covered in 500,000 twinkling lights, accompanied by an electronic synthesizer soundtrack that became instantly iconic. The parade featured beloved Disney characters rendered in glowing animated light, moving down Main Street like a river of pure electricity and joy. The Main Street Electrical Parade became one of Disneyland's most beloved traditions, running for 20 years in its original form and returning multiple times by popular demand. It represented something essential about Disneyland's appeal: the ability to take something simple, lights, music, familiar characters, and transform it into something transcendent. Families would stake out spots along the parade route hours in advance, and children would watch wide-eyed as Cinderella's castle, Peter Pan's pirate ship, and Alice's caterpillar inched past in luminous splendor. As the 1970s drew to a close, Disneyland found itself at a crossroads. It was still immensely popular, still profitable, still beloved by millions. But it was also aging. Some of its technology was looking dated, particularly in Tomorrowland, where visions of the future from 1955 and 1967 were starting to feel quaint rather than aspirational. The park needed not just maintenance, but reimagination. The question was whether Disney's leadership had the vision and courage to undertake such a transformation, or whether they would continue managing decline with fresh paint and recycled ideas. The answer would come in the 1980s, when a new leader would shake the company to its foundations and force Disneyland to confront its own relevance in a rapidly changing entertainment landscape. By 1983, Disneyland was celebrating its 28th birthday, but there wasn't much to celebrate. The park that had once defined innovation in entertainment was starting to feel stale. Attendance had plateaued, and worse, the average age of visitors was creeping upward. Young adults were increasingly viewing Disneyland as something for children or nostalgic grandparents, not them. The Disney company itself was in crisis, facing hostile takeover attempts and accusations that it had lost its creative spark. Then came a corporate shakeup that would change everything. Michael Eisner, executive from Paramount Pictures, was named CEO, and he brought with him Frank Wells as president. Eisner had a reputation as a creative risk-taker who understood both entertainment and business. One of his first major decisions was to greenlight something that would have been unthinkable just years earlier: a complete reimagining of Fantasyland, the heart of Walt's original park. The old Fantasyland, with its medieval tournament tent aesthetic and dark rides, housed in simple buildings, had charm but lacked sophistication. Eisner and his team decided to tear most of it down and rebuild it from scratch. The new Fantasyland, which opened in phases throughout 1983, transformed those simple dark rides into elaborate miniature castles and fairy tale buildings. Peter Pan's flight got a proper London facade. Pinocchio's daring journey moved into a detailed alpine village, and the entire area felt more immersive, more three-dimensional. This $100 million renovation signaled a new philosophy. Disneyland wouldn't just maintain what Walt had built. It would dare to improve upon it. Not everyone was happy about this. Purists complained that Disney was tampering with sacred ground, that changing Walt's original vision was sacrilege. But Eisner argued correctly that Walt himself had constantly changed and improved the park. Stagnation, not evolution, would be the real betrayal of Walt's legacy. The new leadership also tackled the ticket book system, which had become increasingly unpopular. In June 1982, Disneyland introduced an unlimited-use admission passport. Pay one price at the gate and ride everything as many times as you wanted. The change was revolutionary for guests who no longer had to ration their favorite attractions or carry around ticket booklets. The passport system also dramatically simplified park operations and proved immediately successful, with guests spending more time on attractions and less time managing tickets. But Eisner's most audacious move was yet to come. In 1984, he announced plans for Star Tours, an attraction based on the Star Wars franchise that would use flight simulator technology to create the sensation of a wild space adventure. This represented a dramatic departure from traditional theme park rides. Guests would sit in a motion simulator that moved in sync with the film projected on a screen, creating the illusion of piloting a spacecraft through asteroid fields and battles. Star Tours opened on January 9, 1987, and the response was overwhelming. Lines stretched for 4 to 5 hours as Star Wars fans and theme park enthusiasts rushed to experience this new form of entertainment. The attraction featured over 60 different randomized motion combinations synchronized to the film, meaning each ride could feel slightly different. The technology was provided by Rediffusion Simulation, the same company that built flight simulators for commercial airlines and military training. Disney had essentially turned a tool for training pilots into a theme park attraction. The success of Star Tours proved that Disneyland could partner with outside intellectual properties, something Walt had generally avoided, and create attractions that felt authentically Disney while celebrating other creators' work. This opened the door to future collaborations and expansions that would have been impossible under the old guard's more insular approach. George Lucas himself worked closely with Disney's Imagineers, ensuring the attraction captured the spirit of his films while pushing technical boundaries. Around this same time, Disneyland introduced another innovation that seems obvious in retrospect but was groundbreaking at the time: annual passes at a reasonable price point. Previous annual passes had been prohibitively expensive, designed mainly for corporate sponsors. The new passes, introduced in the mid-1980s, were priced to encourage locals to visit frequently. This created a devoted base of regulars who came to the park not for once-in-a-lifetime visits, but as a regular leisure activity, almost like going to a local park or museum. These annual pass holders became some of Disneyland's most passionate ambassadors. They knew every corner of the park, noticed every small change, and spent money on food, merchandise, and special events. They also provided consistent attendance during off-peak seasons, smoothing out the dramatic peaks and valleys that had previously characterized park attendance. Within a few years, annual pass holders would account for nearly half of all park visits. Yet not everything from this era was forward-looking. In 1986, Captain EO, a 3D film starring Michael Jackson and directed by Francis Ford Coppola, opened in Tomorrowland. With a production budget of $23 million, it was the most expensive film per minute ever made at that time. The 17-minute spectacular featured elaborate sets, dazzling special effects, and Jackson at the height of his fame performing original music. It was undeniably impressive, but it also represented a troubling trend, replacing rides and interactive experiences with passive film-based attractions that required less maintenance and could handle larger crowds more efficiently. As the 1980s progressed, Disneyland was clearly in the midst of a renaissance, shaking off the doldrums of the previous decade. Eisner's leadership had injected new energy, new ideas, and perhaps most importantly, a willingness to take risks. The park was investing in cutting-edge technology, reimagining classic areas, and finding ways to appeal to new generations without alienating those who had grown up with Walt's original vision. The question now wasn't whether Disneyland could survive, but how far it could grow. And the answer to that question would soon become literal, as Disney prepared to announce the most significant expansion in the park's history: a second gate, an entirely new park right next door. Before Disney could build that second gate, there was still work to do on the original park. In 1979, Disneyland had opened Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, a runaway mine train roller coaster that became an instant classic in Frontierland. The attraction was built on an island in the rivers of America, accessible only by tunnel, and it featured some of the most elaborate theming ever created for a roller coaster. Guests raced through the fictional Rainbow Ridge mining town past fallen rocks, exploding dynamite, and over 20 audio-animatronic animals, including goats, donkeys, and a mischievous opossum family. Big Thunder cost approximately $17 million to build, and every dollar showed. The mountain itself rose 104 feet into the air and contained nearly 200,000 gallons of water flowing through its caverns and around its base. Imagineers had studied real western rock formations, particularly those in Bryce Canyon and Monument Valley, to create authentic-looking geological features. The ride vehicles themselves were designed to look like vintage mine trains, complete with weathering and details that suggested decades of hard use in the desert sun. What made Big Thunder special wasn't just the thrills. Though at 30 miles per hour through hairpin turns and sudden drops, it provided plenty. But the storytelling. Every scene told part of a larger narrative about a cursed gold mine where supernatural forces caused chaos. Riders could spot details like a saloon with a player piano still playing, mining equipment that seemed to operate by itself, and mysterious, glowing eyes watching from the darkness. It was a roller coaster that rewarded repeat visits, as guests discovered new details each time. But the attraction that would truly define the late 1980s was still to come. In 1989, Disneyland opened Splash Mountain, a log flume ride based on the 1946 Disney film Song of the South. The attraction took guests on a journey through the stories of B.R. Rabbit, B.R. Fox, and B.R. Bear, culminating in a 5-story, 52-foot plunge into a briar-filled splash pool below. At the time of its opening, it was the tallest, steepest flume drop in the world. Splash Mountain was a masterpiece of Audio-Animatronics technology, featuring over 100 animated figures and 950 feet of winding, story-filled flume. The attraction began innocently enough, with cheerful scenes of B.R. Rabbit leaving home and encountering various swamp creatures, all singing "How Do You Do?" But as the story progressed, tensions mounted, and guests found themselves climbing higher and higher inside the mountain, knowing that inevitable drop was coming. The final plunge was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Riders could see daylight ahead, a glimpse of the park outside, and then suddenly they were falling practically vertical, with enough time for one good scream before hitting the water below with a tremendous splash. Cameras captured guests' faces at the moment of the drop, creating souvenir photos that became nearly as popular as the ride itself. Parents loved the images of their children's sheer terror and joy. The ride ended with everyone soaking wet but grinning, drifting past a finale scene where all the characters sang Zip-de-Doo on Celebration. Splash Mountain instantly became one of Disneyland's most popular attractions, with wait times regularly exceeding 2 hours. On hot summer days, some guests rode it repeatedly just to cool off, treating the massive splash as a feature rather than a consequence. Behind the scenes, Disney was planning something that would fundamentally change Disneyland's place in the entertainment landscape. The park had always been limited by its original footprint, that 160 acres in Anaheim that had once seemed vast, but now felt constraining. Walt Disney World in Florida had room to expand endlessly, but Disneyland was hemmed in by city streets and development. The solution, Disney decided, was to build upward and outward in the only direction available, a massive parking lot across the street. In the late 1980s, Disney began quietly acquiring land and planning what would eventually become the Disneyland Resort, a multi-park, multi-hotel complex that would transform Disneyland from a single theme park into a full vacation destination. The centerpiece would be a second theme park focused on California itself, celebrating the state's history, culture, and Disney's own California heritage. But that was still years away from realization. Meanwhile, Disneyland continued its pattern of constant evolution. In 1987, the Videopolis Dance Club opened in Fantasyland, attempting to capture the MTV generation with a high-energy space for live performances and music videos. It was a bold attempt to make Disneyland feel relevant to teenagers and young adults, though it never quite achieved the cultural impact Disney hoped for. The space would eventually be transformed multiple times, reflecting Disney's ongoing struggle to keep Tomorrowland and other areas feeling contemporary. The late 1980s also saw increased attention to seasonal events. Mickey's Halloween Treat, which later evolved into Mickey's Halloween Party, began offering special after-hours experiences where guests could trick or treat throughout the park and see special entertainment. These events proved enormously popular and profitable, establishing a model that Disney would expand in coming decades. The park wasn't just a place to visit once or twice. It was becoming a year-round destination with constantly changing offerings. By 1989, Disneyland was in a remarkable position. It had successfully reinvented itself for a new generation, while maintaining the nostalgic appeal that made it special to those who had visited since childhood. Attractions like Space Mountain, Big Thunder, and Splash Mountain proved Disney could still create groundbreaking experiences. The park was profitable, popular, and poised for even greater expansion. But with success came new challenges. How do you top Splash Mountain? How do you keep innovating when you've already created some of the greatest theme park attractions ever built? And most pressingly, how do you expand when you've run out of room? The answers would define Disneyland's journey into the 1990s and beyond, as the little park that Walt built prepared to become something he might never have imagined, the cornerstone of a vast entertainment resort. As the 1990s dawned, Disneyland stood at the threshold of its 35th anniversary, and something remarkable had happened. The park that critics once dismissed as a certain failure, the folly that survived its disastrous opening day by sheer determination, had become an American institution. More than 300 million guests had walked down Main Street, USA, their faces lighting up as Sleeping Beauty Castle came into view for the first time, or the 100th time, because somehow it never got old. In 1990, Disneyland introduced the Indiana Jones Adventure, an attraction that would take 6 years and $100 million to complete. When it finally opened in 1995, it represented everything Disneyland had learned about storytelling, technology, and imagination over 4 decades. Guests climbed aboard military transport vehicles and journeyed into a cursed temple filled with snakes, giant rolling boulders, and ancient traps, all brought to life through a combination of elaborate sets, audio-animatronics, and motion simulator technology that made the vehicles seem to be dodging dangers in real time. The Indiana Jones Adventure featured an audio-animatronic figure so sophisticated that it made the Lincoln figure from 1965 look almost primitive by comparison. The technology had evolved exponentially, yet the principle remained the same. Use innovation to serve the story, to transport guests to another world, to make them believe, even for just a few minutes, that they were really there, really experiencing something extraordinary. And that, perhaps, is the secret that has allowed Disneyland to endure while countless other theme parks have come and gone. It's not just about the rides, thrilling as they may be. It's not just about the characters, beloved as they are. It's about something deeper, a commitment to the idea that the world can be a place of wonder, that imagination matters, that details count, and that magic, real magic, is possible if you're willing to believe in it. Today, Disneyland continues to evolve, just as Walt always intended. The orange groves are long gone, replaced by 2 theme parks, 3 hotels, and a shopping district. The Skyway buckets no longer glide overhead, and attractions that seemed permanent have been replaced by new dreams. But Main Street still smells like fresh popcorn and vanilla. The Haunted Mansion's $9.99 happy haunts still welcome foolish mortals. Pirates still sing in their eternal twilight. and children still tug their parents' hands, racing towards Sleeping Beauty Castle with that unmistakable look of pure joy that transcends generations. Walt Disney once said that Disneyland would never be completed as long as there is imagination left in the world. More than 70 years after construction began on those Anaheim orange groves, his words have proven prophetic. The park continues to grow, to change, to surprise even those who think they know every brick and every secret. Because Disneyland was never really about a place. It was about a promise that somewhere in this complicated, sometimes difficult world, there exists a kingdom where dreams come true, where families create memories that last lifetimes, where father sitting on a park bench watching his daughters ride a carousel could imagine something better and then make it real. And so the gates open each morning just as they have for decades, and a new generation of dreamers steps onto Main Street for the very first time. They can't know yet how this place will shape their memories, how decades from now they'll return with their own children and grandchildren, pointing out details and sharing stories. They can't know that they're walking through someone's impossible dream made manifest, but they can feel it in the music drifting from the bandstand, in the gleam of the castle spires catching the California sun, in the laughter echoing from every corner of the park. They can feel that they've stepped into somewhere special, somewhere timeless, somewhere that proves that with enough imagination, determination, and faith in the impossible, you can build a magic kingdom that lasts forever. Welcome to Disneyland. Welcome home.